The smell of burnt turkey clung to the air. Grease smoke curled toward the chandelier, its crystals trembling in the draft. I tightened my sweater around my shoulders, though the dining room felt stifling hot. Laughter burst around the table, sharp, shrill, cutting like broken glass. My sister Lauren leaned back, her lipstick perfect, her hand resting on Daniel's arm. She raised her wine glass, tilting her head just enough for the diamonds to sparkle. Claire spends her days filing papers. She smirked. She's never had a real achievement. The words cracked through me. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. Mashed potatoes slid back onto the plate with a dull thud. My cousins laughed, trying not to, but I caught their sideways glances. Mom shook her head, lavender perfume drifting across the table, eyes soft on Lauren. Not on me. Never on me. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I pressed my napkin hard against my palm, hiding the tremble. Inside, my thoughts clawed for air. Is this what I am? Just a clerk. Just invisible. I'd spent 2 decades in that courthouse, filing more than paper. I'd traced deeds, matched signatures, pieced together puzzles no one else noticed. Every late night, I'd whispered to myself, they don't need to know. Just do the work. But sitting there, with the smell of scorched stuffing in my nose, I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam my fist down, to shatter her wine glass into silence. Instead, I swallowed hard. I forced a thin smile, though my throat felt raw. Across the table. Daniel's eyes flickered. He wasn't laughing. His fingers tightened around the stem of his champagne flute. For the first time, he looked straight at me. Claire Harper, he asked. His voice cracked, thin and sharp, like a violin string snapping. The laughter died instantly. Forks clinked down against china. The chandelier hummed overhead, a faint vibration filling the silence. Lauren blinked at him, confused. Of course, she said lightly, my sister. I told you, she's nobody. But Daniel's face drained pale. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the marble floor. Sparkling shards scattered near my chair, glittering like ice in the candlelight. His jaw clenched. He couldn't look away from me. I sat straighter, my heart thudding so loud, I thought they'd all hear it. For years I'd been the quiet one, the helper, the overlooked. But in his stare, I saw something new, fear, recognition. He knew my name, not from Lauren's mocking stories, but from somewhere else. Somewhere he never expected it to surface. The room felt colder now. I could hear the wind clawing at the frosted window panes. Pumpkin pie sat at the end of the table, untouched, whipped cream sinking slowly. Mom's voice trembled. Daniel. What's wrong? He shook his head, eyes still fixed on me. Nothing, he whispered, but his hand wouldn't stop shaking. I almost pitied him. Almost. Because I knew the truth he was hiding. And now he realized I knew it too. I looked down at the broken glass near my shoes. The jagged edges sparkled back at me, sharp, unyielding. Just like the files waiting in my apartment drawer. The sealed indictments. The signatures. The land deeds tied to his firm's fraud. My sister smirked again, trying to reclaim the room. She just got lucky with that county job, she said. But Daniel flinched like she'd slapped him. His lips barely moved. She's the investigator, he whispered under his breath. My chest tightened. He knew. He absolutely knew. And if he knew, then so did his firm. So did the men whose names I had underlined in red ink. I pressed my hand against my heart, steadying the rhythm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my fist. I simply leaned forward, met his wide eyes, and let the words fall. Nobody, huh? My voice was calm, but my whole body shook with power I'd hidden for years. The silence in that glittering room stretched. The smell of burnt turkey seemed stronger now, almost choking. For once, no one laughed. For once, Lauren's smile faltered, and I felt something stir in my chest. Recognition, not from them, but from myself. Justice didn't need applause. Sometimes, justice was quiet. Sometimes, it was simply watching the one who mocked you freeze. I picked up my fork again, my hand steady now. The untouched pie gleamed under the chandelier, sweet and waiting. I cut into it slowly, the crust cracking, buttery flakes against my tongue. The taste was warm, rich, steady, like a reminder of what I'd carried all along. I wasn't nobody. Not tonight. Not anymore. But what came after this silence? I wasn't sure I was ready. Would I keep my mouth shut, let the truth stay sealed, or would I finally show them all who I really was? Stay silent, or speak. Comment 1 for silence. Comment 2 for justice. Because this was only the beginning. The night after that dinner, I couldn't sleep. Daniel's face, white as porcelain, haunted me. Why did he know my name? Why did he freeze like that? I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The laughter of my family echoed in my chest, sharp as glass. Morning came with a dull gray sky. I pulled on my coat, stepped out into the chilled St. Louis air. The courthouse loomed ahead, stone walls damp with dew, columns heavy with history. The steps were slick, and I gripped the rail, leather gloves squeaking. Inside, the marble floor felt icy even through my shoes. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The records room smelled of dust and old paper. Rows of metal cabinets stretched like endless soldiers, waiting in silence. Most clerks hated this basement duty. They said it was boring, just filing, just numbers. But to me, it was a puzzle. Each deed, each contract, each faded signature, like clues scattered in plain sight. I pulled open a drawer, the handle sticking for a moment. A folder slid free, rough cardboard edges scratching my fingers. A sting of a paper cut made me flinch. I whispered to myself, barely audible in the humming silence. Nobody sees the patterns but me. I traced a signature with my pen, the ink slightly smudged. Names repeated in places they shouldn't. Developers moving land like chess pieces. Most days, I worked until my coffee went cold. Steam curled up from the chipped mug, fogging my glasses. I rubbed them clean on my sleeve, then leaned closer to the page. It matters, Claire, I reminded myself. Even if they don't notice, it matters. The courthouse clock struck noon, echoing down the hall. When I climbed back up the stairs, sunlight poured through the tall windows. I paused, letting the warmth hit my face. For a second, I imagined someone waiting outside for me. But the street was empty. Just cars rushing past, a bus groaning at the curb. I walked to the diner across the street, the bell jingling as I entered. The waitress smiled. The usual Claire. I nodded. Yes, please. Extra cream. She scribbled on her pad, winked. At least here someone knew my name. I sat in the corner booth, watching people laugh over pancakes and bacon. My phone buzzed against the table. A message from Lorraine. Don't forget, bring wine on Christmas. Nothing cheap this time. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. I wanted to reply, maybe bring your own for once. Instead, I just slid the phone face down. I took a bite of toast, dry and buttered. The crunch filled my mouth, crumbs sticking to my lips. I swallowed hard. I thought of those dusty deeds waiting in my drawer. And I knew somehow that my quiet work was leading somewhere. The world outside carried on, horns blaring, footsteps on wet pavement. Inside, I sipped my coffee, warm and bitter, letting it burn down my throat. For years, I had been silent. But silence can hide strength. And sometimes, silence prepares you for the storm to come. Would you still keep working, day after day, if no one believed in you? The scent of lavender always takes me back. Even now, one whiff and I'm back in our kitchen, mid-1990s. Mom's perfume lingered over the table, mixing with the sweet steam of cooling pie. The radio hummed faintly, crackling with Christmas carols. I sat on the edge of a hard wooden chair, legs dangling, notebook in my lap. Lauren twirled in her cheerleading uniform. Her curls bounced, ribbons fluttering. "Look at her," Mom said, clapping softly. "Our star, our sunshine." I smiled, proud of her. Then Mom's eyes slid toward me. "Claire, set the table. Don't forget the forks." Her voice wasn't unkind. It was casual, dismissive, like my presence was background noise. I slid the silverware across the table. Cold metal pressed against my palms. My heart thudded harder than it should. I wanted her to notice me, just once. Dad came in, loosened his tie, kissed Lauren's cheek. "Cheerleader of the year," he boomed. He didn't see me standing in the doorway, notebook pressed to my chest. I remember thinking, maybe if I stay quiet, I'll bother them less. But the thought carved itself into me, line by line. That night, I wandered into the living room. The old photo album lay open on the coffee table. Plastic sleeves crinkled as I turned the pages. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. But each picture of me seemed altered. In one photo, I was cropped out entirely. Only Lauren's smile remained. In another, my face was half hidden behind a shadow. My stomach clenched. I touched the rough corner of the page, nails scraping. Was I really so forgettable? A tear rolled onto the photo. It blurred the ink date, 1994. I shut the album quickly, my hands shaking. Somewhere upstairs, Lauren's laughter rang again, carefree, golden. I felt the sound slice right through me. Years later, even in the courthouse basement, I'd hear that echo. I'd run my fingers over dusty folders, paper scratching my skin. And inside, a voice whispered, "You don't matter to them." But another voice, quieter, pushed back. "Then prove you do." And I didn't know it then, but every late night at that desk, every careful page turned, was building something. Not for them. For me. For the woman who was done being erased from her own story. I pressed the album closed and slid it back on the shelf. The lavender smell still hung in the air. Sweet, soft, and heavy. Like a perfume meant for someone else. I climbed the stairs, each step hollow under my feet. If your mother cut you from the family pictures, would you still stay silent? The courthouse basement was colder than the street outside. My boots echoed on the marble, each step hollow in the silence. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting a pale green glow. I pulled open a stubborn cabinet drawer. The handle squealed. Metal grinding against metal. Dust lifted in the air, dancing in the shaft of light from a narrow window. The pages smelled of mildew, old ink, something almost metallic. I slipped on a pair of gloves, though the paper still scratched my fingertips. A thin sting cut across my thumb. I sucked in a sharp breath. Folders stacked like bricks, names typed in fading black. I flipped through deed after deed, my eyes scanning the same surnames. Johnson, Brooks, Johnson, Brooks. The repetition prickled my skin. It felt rehearsed, like someone had copied and pasted signatures. I leaned closer, tracing the ink with my pen. The letters looked too perfect, too identical, like a rubber stamp. Couldn't be coincidence. I whispered to the empty room. The buzz of the lights was my only answer. Somewhere above, a door slammed shut, the sound rolling down the stairwell. I sat back, heart beating faster than it should. This was bigger than a simple misfile. I remembered Margaret's words on the phone. "Truth matters, Claire. Even if it hurts." I wanted to believe her. But another voice whispered, "If you dig too deep, you'll destroy her happiness." I closed my eyes for a moment. The scent of coffee grounds from my thermos drifted up, bitter and grounding. I took a sip, heat burning my tongue. I pressed the cup to my lips, staring at the papers spread wide. Somewhere in these lines, a storm was brewing. The courthouse clock rang 3 sharp chimes. I jumped, nearly dropping the folder. My palms were damp, the gloves sticking. I wiped them against my skirt, then turned one more page. The signature stared back at me. Daniel Brooks. Bold. Clean. Familiar from the dinner table just nights ago. I traced the letters again, my breath catching. Lauren's fiancé wasn't just a polished lawyer. His name was tied to land deals I knew were fraudulent. My stomach twisted hard. I pressed my hand against the page, as if I could erase it. But ink doesn't lie. Not in this room. Not under these lights. The truth was staring right at me, daring me to move. I carried the folder home like it was a live wire. Snowflakes clung to my coat, melting into dark spots. The hallway smelled of fried onions from my neighbor's dinner. Inside my apartment, the heat groaned from the vents. I set the file down on my small wooden table, papers spilling across. I brewed another pot of coffee. The hiss of the machine filled the silence. Steam curled upward, fogging my glasses until I wiped them with my sleeve. The bitter scent wrapped around me, sharp and grounding. I pulled the flash drive from my bag and plugged it in. The screen glowed pale against the darkness. I scrolled through scanned deeds, each one dated, notarized, stamped. Yet the signatures repeated, too neat, too familiar. Brooks, Johnson. Brooks again. Each page a puzzle piece sliding into place. My pulse quickened. I highlighted names in yellow, circled addresses in red. The patterns spread across the map of the county, properties flipping hands at lightning speed, values doubling overnight. It wasn't sloppy. It was calculated. I leaned closer, tracing the typed names with my finger. They think no one notices, I muttered. My voice cracked in the quiet room. I thought back to Thanksgiving, to Daniel's face draining pale. He knew me. He knew why. I pulled another stack of papers from the folder. Cardboard edges scraped my skin. I winced, pressing the cut thumb against a tissue. The radiator clanged, heat rushing through the pipes. Outside, sleet tapped against the window in a restless rhythm. In the middle of the stack, I found it. A deed transfer, thicker than the rest. The paper was heavier, the ink darker, almost smudged with urgency. Across the bottom, the name stared back at me again. Daniel Brooks. This time, the signature wasn't just repeated, it was forged. The pen strokes stuttered, uneven, like a hand forcing itself steady. My breath caught. I whispered, "Gotcha." The word felt dangerous on my tongue, like a secret bullet. I leaned back, chair creaking. My shoulders pressed into the worn fabric, my chest rising fast. I thought of Lauren's laughter, Mom's lavender perfume, Daniel's shaking hand. I pressed the flash drive tighter, knuckles whitening. For years I'd been the invisible one, but here was proof. Solid, undeniable. I stared at the glowing screen, the highlighted names forming lines like veins. A network of greed pulsing beneath the city I served. I wasn't just filing papers. I was uncovering rot, one page at a time. And the rot now had a name. The apartment felt smaller that night. Papers covered every inch of my table, spilling onto the floor. The desk lamp buzzed, casting a yellow pool over the chaos. Outside, rain hammered the window, each drop sharp as glass. I leaned forward, elbows pressed into the wood, head heavy in my hands. The forged signature glared at me from the top page. Daniel Brooks. The ink shimmered faintly under the light. I couldn't look away. My stomach clenched, a knot that wouldn't ease. What do I do with this? If I reported it, Lauren's life would shatter. Her fairy tale fiancé, her perfect engagement, her golden glow. Mom would turn on me, no hesitation. Again invisible. Again the villain. I pressed my palms together, whispering into the quiet. I'm not trying to hurt her. I'm just doing my job. The radiator groaned in reply, heat rattling the pipes. I stared at my own reflection in the window glass. Eyes tired, hair tangled, lips pressed thin. The phone vibrated against the table. Margaret's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Her voice came warm, steady, like a lifeline. Claire, you sound off. What's going on? Why swallowed hard? It's nothing. Just work. Silence stretched on her end. Then she said softly, Truth matters, Claire. Even if it hurts. I closed my eyes. Her words sank deep, steadying me. I whispered, Yeah, I know. After the call, I reached for the flash drive. The plastic felt cold, almost slick in my hand. I slid it into the port, copied the entire folder. The progress bar crawled across the screen, green inching forward. My pulse matched its rhythm. Steady, relentless. When it finished, I yanked the drive free. I slipped it into a small envelope, then tucked it into my purse. The purse felt heavier now, dragging against the chair back. I looked down at the table one last time. Files, highlighters, sticky notes like battle scars. I whispered to myself, This isn't betrayal. This is survival. The words didn't sound convincing, but they were all I had. I gathered the papers, stacking them tight, shoving them back into the folder. My hands shook, but my back stayed straight. I slid the folder into my desk drawer, shut it with a slam. The rain softened outside, fading into mist. The air smelled of damp wood and burnt coffee. I sat alone in the silence, heart still pounding. I thought of Lauren's laughter, of Daniel's pale face at dinner. And I knew. I couldn't unknow what I had found. Would you betray your sister's peace to expose the truth? The house smelled of cinnamon and pine. Fire crackled in the hearth, sparks popping against the grate. I stood in the doorway for a moment, snow still clinging to my coat. Laughter spilled from the living room, warm and sharp at the same time. Christmas at the Harpers. Same as always. Lauren sat near the fire, her ring glittering in the flames. She lifted her hand, turning it this way and that, letting the cousins gasp. Daniel did well, Aunt Carol said, eyes wide. Lauren leaned back, smile slow, proud. Mom perched on the arm of the couch, glowing with her. I slipped into a corner chair, my hands tight in my lap. The mug of cider Mom thrust into my hands was lukewarm. Its sweetness stuck in my throat, thick and heavy. I sipped anyway, though the taste soared on my tongue. The voices blurred together, rising and falling like a chorus. Claire, Mom said, finally noticing me. Her voice carried no sharpness, just mild surprise. You came. I nodded. Of course I came. Her smile faltered, then she turned back to Lauren. I let my gaze drop to the carpet. The threads were worn thin, patterns faded by years of footsteps. I traced them with my eyes, anything to avoid the glimmer of diamonds. My stomach twisted tighter with every laugh that wasn't mine. Heat from the fire licked my cheeks, but inside I felt cold. Claire, tell them about your work, Lauren said suddenly. Her voice was syrupy sweet, but her eyes glittered with mischief. I stiffened. The room grew quiet, waiting. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Lauren leaned forward, tone sharper now. She files papers, y'all. That's it. Filing cabinets, drawers, dust. Not exactly headline material, is it? A ripple of chuckles moved through the room. My chest burned, my pulse in my ears. I lifted my glass too quickly, cider sloshing onto my hand. The cold rim pressed against my palm. I squeezed tighter, fingers aching. A crack split through the glass, thin but sharp. I froze, staring at the fracture snaking across its surface. Mom gasped. Claire, careful. I set the glass down before it shattered, my hand trembling. The room shifted back to chatter, but I couldn't breathe. I stared into the fire, sparks bursting, smoke drifting up the chimney. Inside, words screamed to be spoken, but my lips stayed sealed. The snow had turned to slush by the time I drove home. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching into blurred streaks. I parked, killed the engine, and sat for a long minute in silence. The echo of laughter still rang in my ears, sharp as needles. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. Inside my apartment, the radiator hissed and clanged. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee from the morning pot. I hung up my coat, boots dripping onto the mat. The quiet felt heavy, pressing against my chest. I wanted to drown out their voices, but silence only amplified them. On the shelf sat the old photo album. Its spine cracked, leather worn soft from years of handling. I pulled it down, the weight heavier than it should be. Dust rose as I laid it on the table. The pages rustled when I turned them, a brittle whisper in the room. Birthdays. Vacations. Holidays filled with laughter that seemed louder on paper than it ever was in memory. I traced my finger over one snapshot. Lauren blowing candles, Mom beaming. I stood blurred in the background, half cut off by the frame. Another photo. Dad holding Lauren on his shoulders at the county fair. My hand clutched a balloon beside them, but only half my body was visible. The balloon filled more space than I did. I flipped forward faster now, pulse climbing with each page. Graduations, Christmas trees, weddings. In every image, I was smaller. Tucked in the corner. Cropped at the edges. Sometimes missing altogether. It felt deliberate, like a silent erasure over years. My chest tightened, heat rising behind my eyes. I pressed the heel of my hand against my face, willing back tears. But they came anyway, wetting the photos, blurring the ink dates, 1994, 1997, 2001. Decades of proof that I had been invisible long before Lauren's fiancé froze at my name. This was the legacy I'd been handed. Absence. The lamp buzzed softly above me, casting yellow light across the table. I shut the album with a sharp snap. The sound echoed through the apartment, louder than it should have been. I slid it back onto the shelf, my hands shaking. In the silence, my heartbeat thudded like a drum. If your own family erased you from every memory, would you still forgive them? The courthouse hallway stretched long and cold. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, humming in steady rhythm. My heels clicked against the stone floor, each step echoing too loud. I clutched the envelope tight against my chest. Inside, the flash drive felt heavier than metal should. At the end of the corridor, a brass plaque read, Attorney General's Office. I paused, breath fogging in the chill of recycled air. The smell of coffee drifted faintly from a nearby break room. For a moment, I wanted to turn back, to tuck the envelope away forever. But my hand rose and knocked. 3 sharp raps against the wood. The door opened. Linda Martinez stood there, tailored suit, silver hair tied back. Her eyes scanned me quickly, then softened. "Claire Harper?" she asked. I nodded, throat too tight to speak. She led me inside. The office smelled of paper and fresh ink. Stacks of files lined the desk, thick with secrets. I placed the envelope carefully in front of her. My hand lingered a second before I let go. Martinez pulled on gloves, slit the envelope with a letter opener. She slid the flash drive out, holding it between 2 fingers. Her voice was steady, low. "Do you understand what this means, Claire?" I swallowed, forcing my words out. "It means it's not just paperwork anymore." She met my eyes, sharp and unblinking. "It means people will fall. Important people. And once this moves forward, you can't take it back." Her tone carried both warning and respect. I shifted in the chair, my palms damp. The radiator ticked softly in the corner. "I don't want to destroy her," I whispered. "Lauren doesn't even know." The words trembled, breaking against the still air. Martinez leaned forward. "You're not destroying. You're uncovering. There's a difference." Her pen scratched across a form, black ink biting into paper. "Stay quiet. Do your job. Leave the rest to us. She pushed the paper toward me. I signed, my name looping unevenly across the line. The pen felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of betrayal. When I set it down, my hand shook. Martinez slid the form back into a folder, sealing it with a snap. "You did good, Claire," she said. I nodded, though my chest felt hollow. The hallway outside waited, cold and bright. I stepped back into it, purse pressed to my side, legs unsteady. Each echo of my footsteps sounded like a verdict. And in my ears, Lauren's laughter from Christmas still lingered. The restaurant glittered like a jewel box. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across polished floors, mirrors doubling the shine. Servers in black jackets moved in silence, trays balanced with champagne flutes. I stood in the doorway for a beat, coat still damp from the December air. The hum of voices, the clink of glass, the swell of music, it all pressed close. Lauren spotted me first. "Claire," she called, voice lilting, sweetened for the crowd. Heads turned. I forced a smile, stepped forward, heels clicking against marble. The scent of roasted lamb and buttered rolls filled the air. She swept toward me, gown of deep red shimmering. Her hand flashed, the diamond catching every shard of light. "Daniel, look." She came after all. He nodded stiffly, eyes shadowed. I caught the flicker in his gaze, the unease he didn't hide fast enough. I found my seat near the end of the long banquet table. Gold-rimmed plates, folded napkins like swans, candles flickering low. I folded my hands in my lap, steadying my breath. The laughter rolled on, effortless, practiced. I reached for my water, the glass cool against my palm. Lauren lifted her flute, standing tall at the head of the table. "Friends, family, thank you for celebrating with us tonight." Her voice carried, smooth as silk. "I want to honor my fiancé, Daniel Brooks, the most brilliant lawyer I know." Applause rippled, forks clinking against china. Then her smile tilted, eyes gleaming. "And my sister Claire," she added, turning toward me. "She keeps records at the courthouse. Filing cabinets, drawers, paper clips. Lauder spilled, scattered but sharp. My face burned, but I kept my shoulders straight. Inside, I heard my own voice whisper, "Don't flinch." The chandeliers blurred above me, prisms of light spinning. I thought of the files, the forged signatures, the ink heavy with lies. I thought of Martinez's steady gaze. "You did good, Claire." Daniel raised his glass, but his hand trembled. His knuckles whitened around the stem. The rim clinked too hard against his teeth when he drank. His eyes flicked to me, then away, then back again. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Claire Harper," he said, low almost to himself. The words slid into the air, thin as thread. I froze, every ear in the room straining. Lauren laughed, waving him off. "Yes, my sister, the filing queen." But his glass hit the table too hard. Champagne sloshed, golden liquid spilling onto the cloth. He stared at me, pupils dark, throat working. The music faltered, the string quartet missing a beat. Around us, chatter dulled into uneasy silence. I felt every eye turning. Heat rose up my neck, into my ears. Still, I didn't move. I met his gaze head-on, calm, unblinking. In that moment, his composure cracked. The candlelight caught on his sweat, glistening at his temple. He swallowed hard, mouth dry. I knew he recognized me. Not from family dinners. Not from Lauren's stories. From the files, from the forged deeds. From the truth buried under marble and dust. He knew, and I knew he knew. The silence was almost deafening. The silence stretched so long it felt like the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Daniel's face was ashen, sweat beading along his brow. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced the words out. "She's not just a clerk." Chairs scraped softly as guests leaned closer. Forks stilled in midair. Even the waitstaff paused, trays balanced. Lauren laughed too loudly, brittle around the edges. Of course she's not, darling. She's my sister. But Daniel shook his head, eyes never leaving mine. She's the investigator. The words cracked like ice splitting on a lake. Gasps rippled through the room, whispers breaking into sharp edges. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap. Lauren blinked, confusion flickering across her face. What are you talking about? Her laugh faltered, a thin thread fraying. Daniel's glass slipped from his hand. It shattered against the marble floor, shards glittering in candlelight. The sound rang out like a verdict. Every head turned. No one breathed. Daniel's voice was low, hoarse. Half my firm is under investigation because of her. The room buzzed like a hive. Whispers surged, rising and falling in waves. Names floated. Brooks' firm, indictments, fraud. Lauren's lips parted, her face draining color. She looked at me as though I'd grown into someone she'd never met. Inside, my heart pounded against my ribs, wild and unsteady. But outside, I stayed calm. For years I'd been silent, invisible, erased. And now, truth had spoken for me. I didn't need to raise my voice. I leaned forward slightly, meeting Daniel's broken stare. Nobody, huh? The words fell soft, steady, but they landed hard. A murmur swept through the guests, shock curdling into awe. The string quartet stopped playing altogether, bows frozen mid-air. Lauren staggered back a step. Her gown brushed against the chair, fabric whispering. "Daniel, tell me you're joking," she whispered. But he didn't. He couldn't. He wiped his forehead with a shaking hand. "It's not, it wasn't supposed to come out like this." His voice cracked, broken in front of everyone. He looked smaller, the polished shine stripped away. The diamond on Lauren's hand suddenly seemed cheap. I sat straighter, the chandelier light splintering into prisms above me. My reflection shimmered in every glass, every mirror. For once, I wasn't invisible. For once, the room bent toward me. Silence hung, waiting for my next move. I picked up my water, lifted it steady. The glass was cool, smooth, solid against my palm. I took a slow sip, placed it back down. My voice, when it came, was level. "You knew my name before tonight, now they all do." Gasps, whispers, the shuffle of feet. Someone coughed, nervous, sharp. Lauren's diamond hand shook. Her lips trembled as she faced me. You ruined everything." But I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. The broken glass at our feet said enough. The sweat on Daniel's brow said enough. The silence of every guest said enough. I breathed in, steady, calm, the scent of champagne mixed with wax and smoke from candles. It filled my lungs like proof of survival. Justice didn't roar. Sometimes, justice whispered. The night air cut sharp against my skin. I stepped out of the restaurant, heels clicking on wet stone. The December wind rushed down the street, curling white breath from my lips. Behind me, the muffled hum of voices still stirred, shocked and broken. But I didn't look back. I pulled my coat tighter, collar brushing my chin. Snowflakes drifted, catching under the glow of yellow street lamps. Each one melted fast on the black pavement, disappearing like nothing. My chest felt the same. Hollow, fading, erased. The city moved on, cars swishing past, horns echoing far away. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit with one word, Mom. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the green button. The cold wind howled, tugging at my scarf. Finally, I answered. "Claire." Her voice snapped, sharp with disbelief. "What did you think you were doing? You humiliated your sister. On her night, her moment. How could you?" The words stabbed deeper than the icy air. I stopped under a flickering lamp, heart hammering. "I didn't plan that," I said quietly. "It wasn't me who spilled it." She scoffed, breath hissing through the speaker. "Don't twist this. You've always been jealous. You couldn't let her have the spotlight. Tears burned hot against my lashes, freezing quick in the wind. I pressed my purse close, feeling the shape of the envelope inside. The flash drive was still there, heavy as a stone. I whispered, I only told the truth. But she had already hung up. The silence in my ear rang louder than her voice had. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, throat tight. The city stretched empty ahead of me. My boots struck steady against the sidewalk, echoing off dark buildings. Each step carried me further into a life I couldn't turn back from. A gust of wind ripped through, numbing my cheeks. I pressed forward, past shuttered shops, neon signs flickering half dead. Every window I passed threw back my reflection. A woman alone, hair tangled, eyes rimmed red, but still walking, still carrying the truth. I thought of Daniel's shattered glass, of Lauren's shocked silence. I thought of Martinez's warning. Once this moves forward, you can't take it back. The words pulsed in my ears, steady as footsteps. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself. And I kept walking. The apartment greeted me with silence. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door, the clink loud in the stillness. The radiator hissed, trying but failing to chase away the December chill. I shrugged off my coat and let it fall across the chair. The smell of old coffee lingered from the pot I'd abandoned earlier. I sank into my desk chair. The flash drive sat on the table, its small shape commanding the whole room. Beside it, stacks of files leaned like wary towers. Yellow highlighter streaks glowed faintly in the lamp's weak light. The clock ticked above me, steady, relentless. I buried my face in my hands. Hot tears leaked through my fingers, falling onto the papers. Blotches spread across ink, smearing lines I had drawn with such care. My chest shook, ragged sobs forcing their way out. In my own home, with no one watching, I let myself break. Maybe Mom is right, I thought. Maybe I am jealous. Maybe I should have stayed silent. The words looped like poison, each one sinking deeper. I stared at my reflection in the darkened window. A woman with red eyes, hair clinging damp to her cheeks. The phone buzzed. Margaret's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated, then answered, voice rough. She didn't ask questions right away. She just said, Claire, breathe. I tried, shaky at first, then deeper. The sound of her steady voice wrapped around me like a blanket. You're stronger than you think, she continued. Don't let them erase you again. My throat tightened, fresh tears threatening. I feel like nobody, I whispered. Margaret paused, then spoke firmly. Then why are powerful men afraid of you? Oh, her words landed heavy, pushing through the fog. I closed my eyes, letting them settle into me. For a moment, the apartment didn't feel so empty. The lamp's glow softened, the ticking clock less harsh. I could almost believe her. Almost. But the ache in my chest remained. We said goodnight, and the silence returned. I sat at the desk again, wiping the wet spots from the files. The flash drive gleamed under the light, a reminder of what I carried. The city outside hummed faintly, cars hissing through wet streets. I pressed my palms flat against the table, grounding myself. Dawn seeped through the blinds, pale gold cutting across my desk. The apartment smelled of cold air and burnt dust from the radiator. I hadn't really slept, just drifted in and out, haunted by voices. But when the light came, something shifted inside me. I sat straighter, pulled the files closer. Papers rustled under my fingers. Sticky notes clung to pages, ink circles looping names over and over. I laid them out in neat rows, one beside the other. The patterns glared back at me now, undeniable. Daniel's name stamped across deeds like a shadow I couldn't escape. I brewed fresh coffee. Steam rose, curling into the morning light. The bitter smell steadied me, grounding my thoughts. I took a sip, heat burning my tongue, then placed the cup down with care. My hands didn't shake this time. I switched on the computer, the fan wearing to life. The glow washed over my face, cool and sterile. I slid the flash drive in, copied the last folder. The progress bar crawled forward, slow but steady. My pulse matched it beat for beat. When it finished, I drafted the email. Each word felt like a stone in my chest. Ta Linda Martinez. Subject supporting documents. I attached the files, fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a long moment, I just stared. The voices of my family pressed in. Lauren's laugh, Mom's accusations. But Margaret's voice cut through them. You're stronger than you think. I closed my eyes, breathed deep, and pressed send. The whoosh of the email filled the silence like a bell. I leaned back, exhaling hard. The city outside stirred awake, cars hissing through damp streets. Birds chirped faintly, distant but clear. The world kept moving, indifferent to my choice. But my world had changed. I picked up the flash drive, slipped it back into its envelope. I tucked it inside my purse, zipped it closed. The weight felt different now, not just fear, but resolve. I whispered to the quiet room, I won't be silent anymore. The words hung in the air, firmer this time. Would you press send, knowing it could end your family ties? If you've ever had to choose between truth and peace, share your story below. Because sometimes, speaking up is the only way we heal. Snow crunched under my boots as I climbed the courthouse steps. January air bit at my cheeks, stinging red through the scarf. The stone columns loomed above, their edges frosted white. I paused at the heavy doors, breath clouding in the morning light. My purse weighed on my shoulder, heavier than the files inside. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly of old books and bitter coffee. Security guards nodded as I passed, metal detectors humming low. The marble echoed with every step, each one sharp in the cavernous hall. I kept my head down, coat pulled tight. But inside, my resolve carried me forward. Linda Martinez was waiting in a side office. Her desk was stacked with files, edges bristling with paperclips. A steaming cup of coffee sat at her elbow, scent rich and sharp. She gestured for me to sit. Claire, she said, voice low. You did the right thing. I sank into the chair, hands clasped in my lap. The radiator hissed in the corner, warmth spreading unevenly. Martinez slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of deeds I had provided. Highlighted names leapt off the page. Brooks, Johnson, repeated like a curse. They won't stay quiet forever, Martinez continued. Indictments are drafted. But timing is everything. If we move too soon, they bury us. If we wait, we catch them all at once. Her words landed heavy, like the folder itself. I stared at the documents, heart tightening. Lauren's laughter from Christmas still echoed in my chest. I thought of Daniel's glass shattering on marble. Now here it was, printed in black ink, undeniable. A truth too sharp to unsee. What do you want me to do? I asked softly. Martinez studied me for a long moment. Stay silent. Stay steady. When the moment comes, you'll know. And you'll be standing right there. Her pen tapped once against the desk, steady rhythm. I nodded, throat dry. Silence pressed between us, thick as the winter outside. Finally, she leaned back, eyes narrowing. You understand. Once this breaks, there's no going back. I left the office clutching the folder. The hallway lights buzzed, floor slick with melting snow. Outside, the sky was pale gray, heavy with more flakes. I pulled in a breath so cold it burned. My pulse thudded in my ears. The apartment was dark when I returned. I didn't switch on the overhead light. Instead, I lit a single candle, its glow soft against the walls. The flame flickered, shadows stretching across stacks of files. Outside, wind scraped against the windows, rattling loose panes. I pulled my journal from the drawer. The leather cover was cracked, corners bent. I opened to a blank page, pen trembling in my hand. The ink flowed slow, blotting where the nib pressed too long. I began to write. I loved her once. I scribbled. The words slanted and uneven. Lauren was sunshine. She pulled smiles from every room. And me. I stayed in the corners, hoping for scraps of light. The letters blurred as tears welled. I wiped them quickly, smudging the ink. Memories tumbled in, uninvited. Lauren's cheerleading uniform, ribbons bouncing. Mom's proud clap echoing across the kitchen. My small hands setting the table, unnoticed. The sting of being cropped from photo after photo. I closed my eyes, candle glow pressing against my lids. The apartment hummed with the radiator's uneven breath. I pressed the pen harder, the words cutting deeper. But now, her fiancé's lies threaten more than me. They threaten every person cheated by his firm. The page filled, black lines crisscrossing like veins. I dropped the pen, rubbed my temples. The smell of ink lingered, metallic and sharp. The candle sputtered, wax dripping onto the desk. I whispered into the stillness, "Justice calls, even if blood ties scream louder." My chest tightened, torn between love and duty. I saw Lauren's face, soft when she was a child, and her smirk at Thanksgiving, sharp enough to cut. I pressed the journal shut, the leather groaning. For a moment I just breathed. The window pane shuddered as the wind rose. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders. The files loomed beside the candle, shadows stacked high. In their silence, they seemed to ask the same question my heart did. Would I protect her? Or expose the truth? I leaned closer to the flame, whispered to myself. I can't unsee it. I can't unknow it. The candlelight quivered, as if agreeing. The choice was already made. Only the moment of reveal remained. Margaret's kitchen smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread. The oven ticked, its timer humming before a soft ding broke the silence. Warmth wrapped around me the moment I stepped inside. It felt like another world. Softer, kinder, safer. I hadn't realized how cold my apartment had become until now. She set a loaf on the counter, steam curling into the air. "Sit," she said, handing me a plate. The bread crackled as I tore a piece, butter melting across the crust. For the first time in days, food didn't taste like ash. It tasted alive. Margaret leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You've done the work, Claire. More than anyone could have." I swallowed, throat tight, her eyes held steady on mine. "But now you have to show them. You can't hide anymore." I looked down at my hands, butter shining on my fingertips. "They'll hate me," I whispered. She shook her head. "They already erased you. The truth is the only way back to yourself." Her voice was calm, but it cut sharp. I nodded, though my stomach twisted. The warmth of her kitchen pressed against my bones, giving me strength. I stayed a while longer, the smell of cinnamon clinging to my coat. When I left, the cold air outside no longer felt as heavy. I carried her words with me. That night, I laid the dress out on my bed. Simple gray, clean lines, nothing flashy. I ran the iron across it, steam hissing, fabric smoothing beneath my hand. The sound was steady, soothing, like breath finding rhythm again. I folded it carefully, placed it on the chair. On the desk, the flash drive waited in its envelope. I slipped it into my purse, zipper closing with a quiet rasp. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror above. Hair pulled back, face pale but steady. Eyes no longer hiding. I pressed my palms against the dresser, leaning close. "You'll walk in tall," I whispered, echoing Margaret's words. "No more shadows." The lamplight caught on the glass, glinting off my determined gaze. The woman staring back was no longer invisible. The night stretched long, but my mind was clear. The decision had been made. I was ready to step into the ballroom. Not as a ghost, but as truth itself. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. The silence was no longer empty. The hotel ballroom glittered brighter than the winter night outside. Crystal chandeliers poured light onto gold-trimmed tables, each draped in ivory linen. A string quartet filled the air with soft music, notes rising and falling like a tide. The scent of roses drifted from tall vases, petals unfolding under the heat of the lamps. Laughter buzzed, glasses chimed, dresses swished across the polished floor. I stood at the entrance, my gray dress plain against the shimmer of sequins and silk. For a moment, no one noticed me. Then a whisper passed, sharp as wind through dry leaves. Heads turned, one after another, eyes catching, widening. The music faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to hear. Lauren was radiant in white satin, her veil brushing the carpet like water. She clutched a bouquet of roses, smile stretched wide. But when her gaze landed on me, her lips stiffened. Her smile froze, brittle at the edges. She turned to Daniel, whispering quick, frantic. Daniel's face was pale, sweat already beading along his temple. His hand tugged at his collar, as though the room had grown hotter. He tried to straighten, but his eyes flicked to me, then away, then back again. The clink of his glass against the table rang too loud. Guests caught it, murmurs rippling down the rows. I walked forward, heels steady against the marble floor. Each step echoed, louder than the quartet, louder than the chatter. I felt the purse at my side, the envelope pressed deep inside. Every breath pulled the rose, scented air into my chest, heavy but grounding. I didn't hurry. I wanted them to see me coming. A cousin whispered near the front, "That's her." Another voice answered, "The sister." The words swirled, mixing with the violin's strained notes. I kept my eyes on Lauren and Daniel, their faces tightening by the second. Lauren clutched her bouquet tighter, knuckles pale under the silk ribbon. The officiant cleared his throat, shuffling papers. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice uneasy. But no one answered. The ballroom was holding its breath, even the chandeliers seemed to hum with tension. I reached my seat, slid into the chair with quiet grace. Every eye followed, every whisper hushed. I smoothed my dress across my lap, lifted my chin. For once, I wasn't hiding in corners. I was the storm waiting in their center. The silence cracked when the ballroom doors swung wide. A sharp gust of cold air rushed in, scattering rose petals across the aisle. Footsteps echoed. Measured, deliberate, heels striking marble. Linda Martinez entered, flanked by two officers in dark suits. The weight of her presence pressed over the crowd like a storm cloud. Gasps broke through the hush. Guests twisted in their chairs, murmurs rising, colliding in frantic whispers. Lauren clutched Daniel's arm, bouquet trembling in her grip. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut. Daniel's jaw locked, lips pressed into a bloodless line. Martinez strode forward, her gaze fixed. She carried a folder tucked under her arm, its edges bristling with clipped papers. The scent of fresh ink and paper drifted faintly as she passed. The officiant stepped back, stumbling, unsure whether to continue. No one stopped her. She reached the front, planted herself before the bride and groom. Her voice carried without a microphone, firm and unyielding. "This proceeding cannot continue." Every guest froze, breath caught in their throats. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker, as if reacting to her words. Lauren's bouquet slipped, roses scattering across the floor. Her eyes darted from Martinez to me, wide and frantic. Daniel stood rigid, sweat sliding down his temple. "On what grounds?" he demanded, voice too loud, too strained. But the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Martinez opened the folder, papers snapping crisp. She read names, dates, deeds, numbers. Each one fell like a hammer, striking harder with every line. Gasps rippled again, louder this time, spreading like fire through the room. Guests turned toward Daniel, whispers rising sharp and fast. I didn't move. I sat in my chair, hands folded, calm in the chaos. The gray fabric of my dress blended with the marble, but my presence did not. I watched Daniel's composure unravel thread by thread. I listened to Lauren's breaths, shallow, ragged, breaking her perfect facade. The officers stepped closer, their shoes thudding in unison. Daniel's eyes darted around the room, searching for escape. There was none. His shoulders sagged under the weight of inevitability. The ballroom was no longer his stage. Lauren dropped to her knees, voice breaking. "This is a mistake." "Tell them, Daniel. Tell them." But he couldn't. His silence was louder than any confession. And every eye in the room knew it. The quartet lowered their bows, silence heavy in the air. No music, no laughter, only the sound of shoes against marble as the officers stepped forward. Their hands closed on Daniel's arms, firm and final. He didn't resist. Just sagged, head bowed, lips moving without sound. The crowd parted, chairs scraping, dresses swishing back. Whispers surged, overlapping, sharp as hail. Fraud investigation, his firm. Lauren stumbled after him, veil dragging, bouquet forgotten on the floor. "Daniel! Say something! Tell them this isn't true!" He didn't answer. The officers led him down the aisle, his polished shoes scuffing. The glitter of his cufflinks caught the chandelier light, hollow shine with no weight. A champagne flute tipped from a table, shattering in the silence. Gasps echoed, the shards glittering like warnings. I stayed seated, hands folded calmly in my lap. The smell of roses mixed with the sharper scent of spilled wine. The wedding cake stood untouched in the corner, frosting gleaming under gold light. Guests craned their necks, torn between pity and shock. But their eyes kept returning to me. Mom rose slowly from her seat. Her pearls trembled against her throat, hand pressed tight to her chest. She whispered my name, voice cracked, half plea, half disbelief. But I couldn't move toward her. Not now. Lauren turned, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Her dress shimmered, but her posture sagged. "You ruined me," she spat, voice hoarse, broken. Her words barely reached me, drowned by whispers of the crowd. I leaned forward, voice low but clear. "I saved myself." The sentence slid through the air, soft as silk, sharp as glass. Her shoulders buckled, bouquet ribbon slipping from her grasp. The room exhaled, a collective shudder. For once, I was not erased. Guests whispered in clusters, heads bent, voices urgent. Some nodded faintly in my direction, others shook their heads. The cake knife clinked back into its stand, unused. The smell of frosting cloyed, thick in the stalled air. The celebration had curdled into reckoning. I rose finally, my chair scraping steady across the floor. Eyes followed as I smoothed my dress, chin lifted. I didn't bow, didn't explain. I just walked past the fallen roses, their petals crushed underfoot. The chandelier above hummed, crystals catching every fractured light. Spring crept in slowly, softening the edges of winter. The snow melted into muddy streams along the sidewalks. Birdsong returned, high and clear, filling the mornings with something like hope. I stood on my porch, hands deep in the soil of a half-filled planter. The earth was cool, damp, crumbling between my fingers. I pressed bulbs into the dirt, covering them gently, one by one. Tulips, red, yellow, white. They would bloom in weeks, their colors pushing through despite the frost. For years, I had been buried too, pressed under weight and shadow. But here I was, planting something new. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and wet pavement. Sunlight stretched across the porch, warming my shoulders. I wiped sweat from my brow with the back of my glove. My nails were rimmed with soil, but I didn't mind. For once, my hands weren't turning pages of evidence. They were building life. Behind me, the screen door creaked. Margaret stepped out, carrying 2 steaming cups. "Thought you could use this," she said, handing one over. The mug was hot, the scent of roasted beans rich and grounding. "Thanks," I murmured, cradling it close. We sat together on the porch steps. The wood was weathered, paint peeling where snow had gnawed at it. Margaret sipped, eyes on the street lined with budding trees. "You've been quiet," she said softly. "Too quiet, maybe?" I let out a slow breath. After everything, silence feels different now. It doesn't mean invisible. It means peace. The words felt strange, but they rang true. Margaret nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. The neighborhood was waking up. A child pedaled past on a red bike, bells jingling. A dog barked down the street, leash rattling in its owner's hand. Life moved forward, careless of the storms that had just passed. And I was finally ready to move with it. I thought back to the ballroom, the shattered glass, Lauren's broken cry, the weight of Daniel's silence as officers led him away. For weeks, those images haunted me in the dark. But here in the daylight, with soil under my nails and coffee warming my chest, they lost their grip. They became reminders, not chains. Margaret reached over, her hand resting on mine. "You built this, Claire. On your own." I looked at the tulip bed, at the dark earth waiting to bloom. "I guess I did," I whispered. The words felt solid, rooted, no longer trembling. Inside, the clock chimed noon, faint through the open window. I rose, stretching, joints cracking softly. The sun climbed higher, light spilling across the porch in golden sheets. I breathed deep, filling my lungs with air that didn't sting anymore. The future no longer felt like a locked drawer. I carried the empty mug inside, setting it gently in the sink. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon soap and fresh bread from Margaret's last visit. I glanced at the small calendar tacked to the wall. April. New season, new start. And maybe, finally, a life that belonged only to me. April sunlight poured through the tall windows of the county hall. Dust motes floated in the beams, drifting like tiny gold flecks. The chamber smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paint. Rows of chairs filled with community members, voices hushed with anticipation. I stood at the back, heart steady, purse clutched at my side. Linda Martinez stepped to the podium. Her heels clicked sharp against the floor, echoing across the chamber. She placed a folder on the stand, lifted her gaze to the room. "Today," she said, her voice firm, "we honor those who fought quietly. The kind of strength you don't see until it saves us all." Her eyes found me. She nodded once, a signal that drew me forward. My heels struck the tile, each step ringing clear. People shifted in their seats, heads turning, whispers swelling. By the time I reached the podium, the hall had gone still. "This woman," Martinez continued, gesturing toward me, "chose truth when silence would have been easier. She uncovered fraud that threatened families, homes, and livelihoods. And she did it without applause, without recognition. But today, we recognize her." Applause erupted, sudden and thunderous. It rolled through the chamber, clapping hands echoing off brick walls. For a moment, I just stood there, letting it wash over me. Not because I needed their approval, but because it proved I had not been invisible all along. I leaned toward the microphone, voice calm. "I didn't do this to be seen. I did it because the truth matters, even when it hurts. Even when it costs family, comfort, or peace. The truth still matters." A silence held for a breath, then applause rose again. I stepped back, my chest lighter than it had been in years. Martinez closed the folder, her eyes steady on mine. "Legacy," she said softly as we passed. "It begins with one choice." I left the chamber into bright April air. The city smelled of blooming trees and hot asphalt. Birdsong cut through the traffic noise, sharp and sweet. I breathed it in, head high, shoulders no longer bent. I had saved myself, and built something stronger than their silence. I thought of Lauren, of Mom, of faces turned away. The ache was still there, but softer now, dulled by time. I didn't need their voices to define me. I had found my own. And I wasn't giving it back. On the courthouse steps, a woman brushed past me. She whispered, "Thank you," eyes wet with tears. I nodded, touched her hand briefly. That was enough. My story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every woman erased. Would you carry the weight of truth? Or set it down to keep the peace? Share your story below. Because justice, even quiet, is never lonely. And if you've ever fought to reclaim your worth, know this: you are not alone.